You've recently returned, as I understand it, from Europe, and you had the opportunity while there to discuss the Common Agricultural Policy, a policy of subsidisation of producers in European community. And also I note the Farm Bill in the USA, because of the economic circumstances that country finds itself in, has been under a lot of pressure. I heard you say this morning that you didn't think the CAP is going to change. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, look, I think there was a very strong commitment with all the politicians that we spoke to that the CAP program, the Common Agricultural Policy, would continue. There was no discussion about it being removed at all. And as a matter of fact, probably where they're talking about having a reduction in the EU budget across the board, that the CAP program, there would probably be less of a reduction in the CAP program than there would be in other programs. So that surprised me a bit, considering the global financial crisis and the pressure on money. So I suppose when you sit down and talk to the politicians and you spend a bit of time in Europe, and you can see that the community is actually embedded in rural areas over there, so the money's flowing back very much into, not just into farmers' pockets, but they see it as a social payment to a certain extent, and an environmental payment, that I can't see any opportunities for that to change. I think there's a very strong political support for that program, and I would consider, remembering that this one is for the next 7 years, and then they start negotiating the next 7 years, I can't see any changes in the foreseeable future.
So what should Australian producers' response be in relation to the ongoing reality of subsidies in these very important markets?
Well, what we've got to do is we've got to identify the areas where we actually can make a change, and you know, as I said this morning, that 20 million Australia trying to tell 550 odd, 520 odd million Europeans that their CAP program shouldn't be in place just sounds a little bit odd. So we're not going to have any influence on that. So let's start identifying the areas that we can have influence. And in many of those areas, it's about doing you know, bilateral trade agreements with countries, identifying areas in there that we can work. The TPP is another area where there are about 7 countries having a look at dealing with trade issues there. It's about gaining access into other markets, working with people in other countries about gaining access into those markets. The really important thing for us is that while there will be an expanding demand for food, and I think everybody acknowledges that, it is making sure that we can actually get access into those markets, and that we can be competitive in those marketplaces when we get there. So even though, you know, we're exporting 60% of what we produce, if we don't get increased access with the increased production we're going to get, then the real value of what the farm gate is going to be will be going down. So we need to increase the demand for the product by getting access into those markets. But then the really important part is that the government understand and work with us to make sure that they're allowing us to be competitive on those international and domestic markets, and they're not imposing pieces of legislation on us that actually add to our cost of production and really drive us out of those markets.
Such a piece of legislation might look like what from the government?
Well, I think a carbon tax was a very good example. It was one that that goes back into the industry from 2 ways. So in reduced prices as prices are passed down, reduced farm gate prices, and increased prices as on the other side of the ledger, things that we're buying have a carbon tax component on them. Now, ideally what you'd say, well, you just shift that onto somebody else, as everybody else does, but in our industry it doesn't work like that. We're at the bottom end, so we have to absorb those into our business. They all go onto our cost of production, and then in the end, you know, if we can't get international prices that cover off on that, then we've got a problem. Now the issue is that when the things come back onto the domestic market, they don't have a carbon component on them, but Australia's own domestic product does have a carbon component on it, so we even become less competitive on the domestic market as well as the international markets.